Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 14, a deeper look into corrections. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode number 14 of the Dog Trainers Podcast. My name is Mariano, that's Brent, and we want to thank you guys so much for the crazy amount of support that we've been receiving, not just for the podcast in general, but especially for the Deeper Look series. And we honestly don't know what to say. I mean, we've been keeping track of all the analytics and things, and for as young as this podcast is, we've just received so much support, so many listeners, so much feedback that I'm almost at a loss for words, but thank you guys very much. And you can find us on Instagram. You can find me at UNTAMEDDOGCO. That's UNTAMEDDOGCO. And you can find Brent at CANISBEHAVIOR. That's CANIS behavior. Both of those are all one word. Now, the topic of this episode is going to be a deeper look into corrections. And we know that that's a hot topic. So we figured we'd do our very best to see if we can't navigate the storm for you guys. So over to you, Brent.
What is up, Mariano? Again, another week has gone by. Still miss your face.
I know, man.
Same story every week.
Ever closer, dude. Ever closer. Things are looking up, I think.
I know. When all this quarantine's done, you're going to come visit, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Very nice. That's all I care about. Again, guys, we want to thank you guys so much for just listening. Like, someone is sharing something, and we want to thank you guys. And a little bit of feedback I got the other day is that people like the short, organized, educational versions of these podcasts, which is great because personally that's how I like to learn. But yeah, whoever's sharing this stuff and sending it out, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate all the views or all the listens. So let's go ahead and talk into this. So as we always do with our Deeper Look series, we do have a little bit of a format, and this one we are particularly talking about what corrections are in dog training. Corrections they do exist. A lot of dog trainers will argue whether they should exist, whether it's necessary. And so we'll talk to you guys a little bit from our perspectives. I've been doing this for 12 years. And so we start to see obviously different perspectives, different dogs, what happens when there's undercorrection, overcorrection. So we're going to get into all of that. But I guess the first place for us to start here is let's go ahead and start with our public perspective of what corrections are, right? So what would you say, Mariano, the public perspective of corrections are?
Well, if we're talking, the public is kind of split down the middle on corrections, which is why this is always going to be such an interesting topic, at least, these last few years and probably for the next few moving forward. So
Right.
there's kind of those two camps. There's like pro-correction, anti-correction. And if you consider the position of anti-correction, people, a lot of them say that it's abusive. A lot of them say that it's cruel, which kind of go hand in hand. People who believe those two things typically think so because they think it's unnecessary and it's not based in science, and they kind of fall into they'll kind of paint the picture of the person who does offer corrections in training as like emotional or suspicious of their dog. We kind of get into the whole like stuff you should know, what we talked about there, where they kind of paint someone as like you're one of those, like, what do they call, like, dominance trainers who's just trying to stop your dog from pulling one over on you.
Right. And it paints a little I wouldn't say unrealistic picture, because definitely there's extremes on both sides, but it definitely paints a little bit more of it just has a dark cloud hovering over it, the word correction.
Right. Yeah.
So a couple things that I wanted to talk about in regards to the public perspective is I think our perspective on the idea of punishment in general as a society and as a people, we're only going to ever be advanced. We're only going to believe what we're used to, right? If that makes sense. So like a lot of the reason that it's so split is because there are people who, have been raised and experienced overcorrection in their childhood, which makes complete sense. Why they wouldn't like overcorrection with a dog, or the concept of being mean, tough, abusive, cruel to a dog, of course. And then on the other side, we see people who, did have a childhood where there were punishments and there were quote unquote corrections done as in our childhoods. And those people turned out fine and actually feel that that's a necessary force in the learning process, right? And so you're always going to see that there's these two camps that are split when we start talking about the ideas of correction. And our job as dog trainers is to kind of help put things in perspective, especially when we're working with dogs, is to put things in perspective for that specific case, that specific dog, because again, things aren't binary, right? There's circumstantial things. There's different behaviors dogs exhibit that humans don't really exhibit that often or for that long. For example, like a baby does not have the natural intention to want to go chase something and put it in its mouth until it's dead. You know what I mean? So there's definitely some canine exclusive habits and behaviors that we're usually controlling when dealing with corrections in dog training.
Yeah, 100%. I think that before we continue and kind of start to express our position on this thing, or our positions if they vary, I want to be clear, kind of like when we talked again about the stuff you should know, that if someone listening to this is pro correction or anti correction or whatever the case, I don't want you to feel like we're attacking you either way. In fact, one of the major reasons that we ever started this podcast, because me and Brent have been friends for years and dog training together for years, and we've always kind of joked at each other, while we were out like at bars and things, like, man, why do dog trainers always, they can really be kind of gung ho in one extreme or the other, and to the point of going after someone who believes of a different sort of perspective. And I think we've been around enough and we've trained enough dogs to know that every of the major, I'm not talking like the weird kind of fringe out there people, but all of the major tried and true dog training methods that have kind of withstood the scrutiny of like the modern age with the need for like proof and social media videos and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They all have their value. They all work in their own particular way, and within each and every one of them individually, there is like a spectrum of how good someone is at that particular methodology. Like there are better food trainers than others, and so on. So,
Right.
we just want to be clear as we start kind of stating where we stand on this whole thing. If you don't agree, it's not a problem. You're welcome here, and we hope vice versa. And it's always good for us to kind of come together and talk these things out so that we can all have open and honest discussions about how we can move this thing forward.
And we're going to do our best to really give context, because
Right.
I think, the reason there's so much disagreement, especially when it comes to correction, is because on both sides, you have individuals that are very protective of their animals, right? So on one side, you have people who are protective and wouldn't dare put the dog under stress or pain or discomfort. And on the other side, there's a whole nother side that believes, if you don't put them under stress or pain, how are they going to know how to behave properly?
Right.
Right. And so you're always going to see these two sides. So just know everyone is coming from the side of we love animals. However, we're trying to achieve harmony from two different sides. So, okay, cool. So let's go into what correction is and its use in dog training. I'll go ahead and just start with my perspectives and the perspectives that I've learned over the years. One of my favorite definitions or just concepts when it comes to what a correction is used for, it's used to block behaviors, right? So for example, I always look at it like, let's say the dog has many decisions to make. So let's say the dog is at this intersection in his mind where he could go left, he could go straight, he could go right, or he could turn back, right? And he has all these different options. Well, the purpose of a correction is to block one of those options from being a possibility, right? And so therefore, if I tell the dog, all right, you can't go left, and this is hypothetical left, obviously, then that means the dog can only go straight or right or back, right? So by me kind of helping limit the dog's options of what they're able to do, we're actually able to guide them to be able to make better decisions, and therefore receive rewards, receive praise, and also learn new behavior sequences that are going to help them, in whatever process they're learning, whether it be sport or whether it be, pet dog training, whether it's, behavior modification, whatever it is, we're trying to teach a new behavioral pattern.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think the way that I look at it, and I'm gonna bust out moving target one more time here, is from this trainer's perspective. I think what a correction is, or what it's supposed to be, is exactly that, something that's meant to block a behavior or a thought process and limit an option. And I think that the reason why, when we talk about why trainers believe this when we're the ones who it's our job to really look into dog behavior and understand the ins and outs of how a dog operates.
Mm-hmm.
It's because when we talk about stress, and people are afraid of putting a dog under stress, or what putting the dog under stress will do to the dog in the long run, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I think one needs to understand proper corrections in context typically mean the dog is already feeling stress to one degree or another, like minus your corrections. And an example being like if the dog is reactive on a leash, I totally believe in food work and its benefit, and I use it every day and stuff like that. But if we're talking leash reactivity, I'm probably going to go with some sort of training method or another, or like a corrective method or another, prong collar, e-collar, something, whatever I think best will motivate this particular dog in this particular set of circumstances. And, I can understand where someone would be afraid of pressuring the dog, but
Mm-hmm.
given that the dog is reacting to people, I would say the dog's already under a pretty significant amount of pressure. And if anything, proper corrections, which we'll get into later what that looks like, can actually go a very long way into pulling that pressure away from a dog. And that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
where I stand on the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess that brings me to another point I wanted to make, just to kind of phrase exactly what you said, but put it in slightly different words. Another use of corrections is to grab and maintain attention,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think a lot of times dogs can live in very emotional, impulsive states, and sometimes they lose themselves in those emotional or impulsive states. And so a lot of times, you'll see some trainers, they use, minor forms of corrections to just grab the dog's attention. Now, don't get me wrong. It's very easy to be correction happy and use it too much versus maybe, using some food or conditioning some type of marker or conditioning some type of focus cue, right? That would be definitely a better way to do it. But definitely one part of use of correction, whether it be a leash jerk, an e-collar pop, a hand clap, anything that could be perceived as aversive to the dog. Some of it is just to grab the dog's attention and snap them out of whatever state of mind they happen to be in at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing to bring up when we talk about the perspective of a trainer versus like the average, like public kind of perspective. And I've got a very quick example as to where these perspectives can differentiate. From a trainer's
Mm-hmm.
perspective, we understand, and again, we'll dive into this later, so I'm not going to harp on it I'm not going to put too fine a point on this, but we understand that corrections come with different like objectives in mind. Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm healing with the dog, and this is a dog, mind you, who has already been taught to heal, so all the work, all the foundational stuff is there. Okay, if I'm healing with the dog and he falls behind me and I turn around because I feel him fall behind me in my leash, and it's because he's like staring at a cat across the street, I'm probably going to give him a correction. I'm going to mark it, no, follow up with the correction, whatever that is, prong, collar, hand clap,
Mm-hmm.
at which point the dog will most likely fix the behavior. I'll mark it again, good. And then we continue with our walk. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the goal for that correction was to break the dog's attention from the cat or whatever it was he was looking at and keep going, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we have a dog that say lunges at someone with intent to like bite, that's going to be a much
Mm-hmm.
firmer correction because I still do
Right.
want to pull that dog, like mentally speaking, off of this person. That objective still
Mm-hmm.
exists, but now there's another one. Now I need to make this correction impactful enough to do that and impactful enough to do kind of the next step up from that, which is to inhibit the dog from even thinking that that's an option in the future. Right.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Now, from the
Exactly.
public perspective, I have a client, currently who it's a board and trained dog who I just got in like Wednesday, and today is Friday, so a few days. Um, their dog is going to be doing a 3-week program. It's a 5-month-old black lab puppy, real sweet young puppy, but very rambunctious, kind of big. Labs are big, and she's small because she's 5 months,
Mm-hmm.
but big because she's a lab. Like she's in that weird.
Is she an English? Is she an English
No,
lab?
no,
Oh no, American.
yeah, American, yeah, yeah.
Love it.
And the deal is, dad's a big guy, like 6 foot plus, kind of big, strong looking dude. Mom's kind of smaller, and mom works from home. Mom deals with the dog most of the time. The
Mm-hmm.
dog is very sweet, nothing negative in her behaviors at all, but she's too much. It's inappropriate. The incessant barking because mom works from home on the phone. Incessant barking in the
Right.
crate, incessant jumping when she's not in the crate, nipping, pulling on walks and stuff, you name it. So we talked about corrections. We talked about different corrective methods. Um, we ended up talking about e-collar stuff because of the off leash kind of aspect to it that they were considering.
Mm-hmm.
And they were unsure as to why an e-collar needs levels. They were like, but why would you want more than one? I don't get it. Like, isn't a correction a correction? And just to explain like how people get
Mm-hmm.
that. And I'm like, no, you actually want a lot, because not all two corrections are created equal. And as we'll get into later, there are
Mm-hmm.
things that aren't necessarily corrections that can still require lower levels of pressure from a prong collar or an e-collar. And so I'll leave
Mm-hmm.
it at that, because I know
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get into this, but I just wanted to kind of give a little example of how people can completely miss the mark, and how it's our job as trainers to make sure that we express these things as clearly as possible.
Right, right. To just branch off of that point, when we're going into corrections, I guess I could bring this up now. Let's the way I like to break into teaching the use of pressure. Right. In dog training, use of corrections or pressure is known as escape and avoidance training. Right. And so the use of positive punishment, where we're adding something to be able to, motivate the dog to refrain from doing a behavior again in the future, or negative reinforcement, where we're applying pressure so that the dog yields and gives into a behavior that we want, right? In essence, like being willful, and the dog has to therefore do what we're asking them, right? To avoid pressure. What ends up happening is a lot of times people can look at correction as a singular item. Like it's just, there's a one type, there aren't any in betweens, there aren't different levels. And I think one of the tricks of a dynamic trainer, I know definitely when you work with leash stuff, it's knowing how to read the animal to be able to give these, what I like to break down into 3 different styles of pressure or corrections, right? So we'll go over the first style of pressure or correction, which I would consider to be a lure, right? So leash lures, in essence, are the use of pressure to be able to help guide our dogs into behavior, right? So if I wanted a dog, for example, to come to me, right? And let's say, for example, the dog didn't want to come because they're staring at a squirrel. Well, I can actually use gentle pressure towards me on the leash to be able to motivate that dog and lure the dog in my direction. Eventually, what's going to happen is that increasing of pressure is actually going to teach that dog that if they don't turn around and see what's pulling on them, that the pressure will not go away. So as soon as the pressure goes away, we let it go. So this is a form of luring the dog to motivate them to do a behavior, right? We can do the same thing in luring the dog into a sit position, luring the dog in a down position, luring the dog into a stay position. There's so many different ways we can lure. And again, these are gentle, but consistently increasing forms of pressure that we can add onto a leash. And even within that realm, there are good and bad practices that maybe we'll talk about on a later video. But luring, so teaching the leash lures. The second thing is reminders. So these reminders, the use of any type of pressure or corrective methods for reminder purposes, these are going to be light but attention grabbing forms of correction. Right. So in essence, a way that we look at this is like tapping someone on the shoulder. Right. So imagine you're at a party and there's lots of music, and you tap someone on the shoulder very lightly and they don't turn around. Right. And so what's the natural response? What should we do? Them
Or tap them
lightly,
harder, right?
then I should tap them a little harder. Right. I should tap them a little harder. So what ends up happening, there has to be a certain level of surprise. There has to be a certain level of attention grabbiness when tapping that person on the shoulder, or else you will not grab their attention amongst all the distractions for them to turn around and check, look at you. So the second form of using corrections or pressure is it going to be to grab attention. Once we have the dog's attention, then we can ask something. Right. Then we can tell them to do something that they already know how to do, or we can redirect them to something that they should be doing. So the reminder aspect is really, really important as well, especially when we start working with distraction work. Okay. Then the very, very last thing, the true traditional aversive correction, or the correction that we're really trying to implement and ingrain in the dog so that they don't continue a behavior. These true corrections are really to end behavior. right, to eliminate the likelihood of a behavior happening again in the future. So these corrections tend to be more reprimandy, right? So these reprimands are really there to lay down a very thick line in the sand for the dog to let them know X, Y, and Z should not have happened. And this is a direct result from the decisions that you made, right? Now, there obviously are good and bad ways of doing this. Those types of corrections in dog training are very far and few between. Very far and few between. And if they're not, that is definitely a big sign of malpractice. And mind you, we're going to only really see those types of corrections in dogs with very severe behavioral issues, or we're only going to see those types of corrections with dogs with very high drive instincts, whether they be prey drive, herding drive, fight drive, competitive drive. The only time a dog will actually get very, very corrective reprimand or should get corrective reprimand is if we usually see it in those levels of dogs, high performance dogs, right? Your average, chill pet, they will get away with with just the use of lure and reminder in the form of
and if they ever need a correction, it'll be a correction. And then they're going to be like, whoops, don't do that again. Got it. Right.
Then they won't do it ever. Exactly. They'll get over it and be like, oh, sorry, just won't do that.
I think now that you spelled that out, and I love the way that you kind of put that with the lures, reminders, and corrections, and we'll definitely be sure to reiterate that. Let's talk about some bad practices then and how people do these things wrong. And I know, this is something in particular, I think, when we talk about a huge portion of why correction has like a negative kind of taste to it is because people end up doing it wrong. And as a result, it's like that weird telephone game of this person did it incorrectly, but then all these other people hear about it. And then they kind of forget about the incorrect part. And they're just like, oops, look what corrections can do to your dog. So
right.
Let me list off a couple of bad practices here, and then I'll just kind of let you harp on them as as we want here. So improper timing. I think that one's a huge one. And I think it has to do with, and I want to hear your, I want to hear what you have to say about this, but I'm just kind of framing it because we promised to give context here. So timing in a correction, and timing in dog training goes
techniques.
Out in all methodologies. Right. Corrections or not, we want to be super clear. All pure positive training, timing is extremely important. And it's because, and this applies directly to corrections too, the dog needs to be able to very clearly and consistently correlate your reaction to their action or vice versa. So if you're correcting a dog for something specific, you need to make sure that you time it appropriately so that the dog understands, oh, this correction was because I did X.
I agree. I think improper timing is really easy to do for a couple reasons, because usually the behaviors we're trying to correct happen so fast. Right. And I think one of the big learning curves that people struggle with is learning how to read and or anticipate the behaviors that actually need to be corrected. Or when we start getting into deeper forms of behavior mod, how to read states of mind that lead to certain behavior shifts. Right. So improper timing is really easy for, I guess we talked about in any method, but definitely when we're dealing with corrections, improper timing is probably one of the main issues that things go wrong, right? One thing I'll add to that is improper timing can also be when you correct the dog for something that had happened either moments before, minutes before, hours before, right? And so, for example, common thing that I hear all the time, my dog pooped in the house or peed in the house. And then the owner comes home several hours later. They see that the dog pooped and peed, so they get upset at the dog. They grab the dog by the scruff of its neck. They take it over to the potty area where they had an accident, and they rub their nose in it and go, no, bad. And sometimes they'll smack the dog, yell at the dog, make the dog feel like shit. And so this is more of what I would consider to be kind of like an emotional correction. And it kind of almost feels slightly like payback or revenge, right? And that not only is it improperly timed, but science has kind of proven that dogs don't get the connection, right? They don't know why you're upset with them at that time.
And what's worse is it builds a connection. It's just a wrong connection. So then it's kind of like you come home, and I've seen this one a lot, which is an extension of that. So you revenge correct a dog. Another one that I hear a lot is like dog got into the trash or like the toilet paper roll or, And so you get home, it happens for the first time. Dog's all excited to see you, and the toilet paper's everywhere. And you go, "What the hell?" And you correct the dog, whatever that, they yell at them, you know, and so dog, of course, doesn't understand why they were just corrected. So they do it again tomorrow. Same thing. You come home, same thing, trash all over the place, and you yell at them, and next day you come home, dog is already kind of on edge, and owners have this like superstition of like, what did you do? I know you did something because you're acting weird.
Right,
You're being avoidant, you're being extra sweet, or whatever the case. And so then they almost like, I've seen people like correct the dog because they're pretty sure he did something.
They didn't even find the evidence.
Yeah,
oh yeah, that's true.
He digs into the trash, but sometimes he eats whatever he brings out. So like, there's no proof, but he's acting weird. I know he did it.
Yeah, that's hilarious. That's true. That is really true. And sometimes, I think just to get off subject a little bit and then come back on, but some people will be like, look how guilty he's acting. Look at it on his face.
Exactly. Right.
And it's not so much that the dog is guilty as much as he knows that you're upset. So he acts a certain way based on how you're acting. So if you come in super happy and smiles, your dog will most likely be happy and smiles. But if you come in, suspicious, holding the dog in contempt and, walking into your house with low energy, the dog's going to be like, oh, what's wrong with mom or dad? Something bad happened. And so they kind of take that as like a confession of guilt, but really it's just the dog responding to your body language.
Yeah. And that was the emotional connection that is made that I'm worried about, because not only doesn't the dog make the connection of, I want you to stop pulling my toilet paper throughout the house, but they start to get like, you come home and it's kind of hit or miss because you're either really excited or really happy. So like, are we cool? Are we cool? And that's what the owner perceives as the dog is looking suspicious. The dog's really just weary of you.
And yeah, he's showing appeasement behavior. He's like, please don't yell at me today.
Right.
Yeah, totally get that. Let's go on to the next one. Here's a good one. I think what happens, so as a result of not actually doing any foundational work, right? So not teaching your dogs things that they should be knowing before you start introducing correction, this tends to lead to excessive correction. Now, I have to admit, especially growing up in Keeler method, there would be a lot of times that I would overcorrect dogs. I would put too much pressure on dogs. And anyone who's ever done Keeler method and survived, in the sense of you've grown out of it, you definitely understand, where certain, you definitely have to learn to moderate and be very, very precise with your corrections if you do not want to, create bad behavioral issues with your dogs, right? Using force or using pressure, right? So escape avoidance training can go very, very wrong if you do not develop foundational pre-learning, right? So food work, positive reinforcement stuff. If you do not, if you don't know how to use motivators properly, if the dog doesn't understand what they should be doing before you start punishing them for doing the wrong things. So I'll argue that all day with any trainer. But yeah, we see that a lot. So excessive corrections due to no foundations or pre-learning is also a really bad practice that we see in the industry.
Yeah. I mean, I would be amazed if any trainer even wanted to argue that with you. That's great. I mean, another thing I noticed is like, even if training doesn't go completely sideways as a result of this, the dog just isn't as sharp as a dog with the proper foundational stuff, because they've been taught not only, I talk about this a lot when we talk about the reason why training works for people. I was just talking to, someone who's going to do a board and train with me like a couple hours ago. And I was trying to explain to them, when you're teaching stuff and you start with your food work, of course you're teaching the behaviors. I mean, if you teach a dog how to sit with food, they're learning how to sit down. Yes. But there's so many other things that the dogs learn alongside the actual command. If you're doing food lessons with your dog and you do them for like a few days or so in a row, you'll notice that the first one is like high-ish energy, and like the fifth one is like, we're ready to rip, because the dog is now excited and he's tuned in, and they've now kind of developed a sense of like of incentive and work ethic, and like, oh man, if I work hard, I can get that, and you'll see this like overall adjustment in the dog. And when they're denied that and they just move straight to corrections, the dog's just kind of like, a dog will work to avoid pressure, yes, but they will always work harder and more fluid and kind of happy and focused to earn praise.
Of course. Or something that they like.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I totally agree, man.
Yeah, and again, corrections are definitely, in our opinion at least, they're viable, they work, they have their place in training, but so does food work, and we're just trying to bridge that gap between, people that may not think one or the other is necessary. Because I know some people that I don't know about corrections necessarily, but they move dogs straight, beginning to end, on like whatever training collar, like no food at all, like just straight e-collar, beginning to end, and it starts as low level pressure, but not even so
Mm-hmm.
much as a few food lessons to get the dog motivated, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is a bit
Mm-hmm.
weird, but we move on. I mean, I think another good one, which kind of goes hand in hand with this, but does branch off. So I'd love to hear you harp on it just a bit, is
Yeah.
overwhelming or underwhelming corrections.
Right. So here's kind of how that works, right? Let's go back to that analogy. So an overwhelming correction would obviously be something that is too strong given the context of the offense, right? That's like, you get a speeding ticket and they send you to, Folsom Prison, like it's like something like that. Like just for a speeding ticket, they send you to prison for 20 years. Like that's an overwhelming correction. Like it's too much. Versus an underwhelming correction would be like a slap on
Right.
the wrist for murder, right? So with dogs, what ends up happening is when we go back to those three types of breakdowns of the use of pressure, the lure, reminders versus corrections. There are some times where reminders are being used in the situations where a correction should be used, right? So let's say, for example, my dog is lunging at something, and instead of getting the dog to stop, refocus, and understand that what he did was very, very wrong, what I'm doing is I'm just giving the dog a little tug to redirect his focus for a brief moment. And what ends up happening 3 seconds later, the dog is back at the same behavior. So usually underwhelming corrections are going to look like they work for 1 or 2 seconds and the dog goes right back to doing what they were supposed to not be doing, right? And so we're going to see that. Now, an overwhelming correction is always going to look like the dog is apologetic or appeasing over something and we lose motivation. And sometimes maybe the reprimand was too strong or too much for the given offense, right? So let's say the dog, I don't know, what's a good one?
I have
The
a perfect one.
dog,
A dog that I'm working with currently. Before me, the owners met with another trainer. Trainer took the dog out. First lesson. This is a reactive dog, herding dog, about a year-ish old now. Um, Started showing reactivity about 7-ish months old. So, dog's about a year. Met with other trainer like, let's say, a month and a half ago. Very first lesson, slaps an e-collar on him, takes him to the park with the owners. Dog starts reacting to things like outwardly lunging and barking. Uh, Trainer corrects the dog at a
mm-hmm,
high level. Dog immediately, of course, stops and yelps, but doesn't even want to be at the park
mm-hmm,
anymore. Is the way that it was worded to me. Now, this same
mm-hmm,
dog, I've since been
mm-hmm,
training this dog, and we are doing e-collar with this dog. Same tool, very different
mm-hmm,
approach. And I'll tell you what, the owners were and are so happy with how the dog is looking because they were nervous about the collar. I'm lucky that they were willing to trust me to even try it again, you know. But I think what it was when I spoke to them
mm-hmm.
about the necessary foundational stuff that should have gone into it. And we did it all: food work, leash work, then moved to the collar. And they could see how the dog responds and how he can actually start to let go of a lot of these pressures and just be happier himself. They trust me so much that the
Mm-hmm.
dog is here now. He's boarding
Mm-hmm.
because they went camping for the weekend, and it's amazing to see proper corrections versus improper corrections. It's a world of difference, even if we're using the same tool.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. It's the argument is never shouldn't be the tool; it should be the
Right,
practitioner
right,
every single time. So if something bad happened with the dog training tool, it was the practitioner, not the tool
right.
itself.
And I brought up that example because I know it was a little off by the wayside of what we were just talking about. But the thing is, it falls in line perfectly with our final point for bad practices, which is using corrections as the sole shaping and reinforcement tool in training.
Here's what happens So in my experience, there are a small percentage of very driven animals that come out of the womb with so much vigor and so much feist and so much just fire in their bellies that you can get away with certain training programs that just solely use correction, right? It's a small percentage though. We're probably talking 20, maybe 30% of, working dogs, right? And what this means is, you pretty much, there's such a great athlete that if you tell them, don't fucking do that, the dog will go, okay, sorry, coach, I'll do better next time. And their simple motivation for the work or their genetic predisposition is enough to just kind of compensate, and they'll figure out what you want them to do. Right. So there's a lot of dogs, especially like when you go into military dog training or you go into protection work, these dogs are bred with such strong genetics that giving them a harsh reprimand here and there doesn't break their spirit. It definitely doesn't, mess them up in a way. And actually some dog trainers would argue that they need that firm hand. And that's where a lot of the military dog training styles came from. Keeler method, some of the protection sports, they use very heavy handed techniques. Well, the old ones, not the modern day ones. But that's where it comes from, because I have a dog with such a strong predisposition. So in those circumstances, yes, a dog trainer can get away with working with dogs using force and pressure to shape behaviors and to reinforce behaviors, right? So in essence, you're using it to manage the dog's tendencies, right?
Can I add? Sorry. So coming from the perspective of someone who kind of started training in that world, I can say too, like I totally get what you're saying of like some dogs are just so driven and just so resilient to like internalizing pressure that they can power through it. And of course, in a military setting, people want to know that the dogs can do this, because of course, if we're talking combat, we're talking a very stressful situation.
Gunfire, explosion.
Right. Yep. Even just people yelling and, so yes, that's true. But man, the prep work that goes into these dogs before they start their actual protective work, like as young puppies, little Mally puppies, there's a ton of food work and a ton of motivational work, because I've seen this a lot. A dog can be an excellent, like on a bite sleeve, a good bitey dog. And we'll talk, let's say a couple dogs from the same litter. So same genetics, roughly same size, stuff like that, same age and everything, of course. And if one of them was given a little too much pressure at a younger age, sometimes the pressure will mount on them and their bite will suffer. So like if we're talking in sport work, you have the little, like the little plastic kind of thing you don't really hit the dog with, but you're kind of putting pressure on the dog because they think they're going to hit in the
stick.
head. Right. And then there's the little whip too, which makes noise. And I've seen a lot of dogs be too bothered by this, or worse, I think, is I've seen a lot of dogs in the moment. These little Mally puppies are the cutest little things, but they have insane drive. And dog grabs right on to the sleeve and just is ripping, and you're wata with the whip and kind of pretending to whack. And the person, if anybody listening has ever seen bite work, the person purposely makes noise as if it hurts we're just kind of adding fuel to the dog, like and moving around to add sort of
building their ego.
Right. But also building all the distraction and all the stuff that could scare a dog off of the bite as well, so that we know that they're solid, kind of like in the military setting. Now here's a crazy thing. In the moment, I've seen this a lot. In the moment, the dog is so driven that they perform anyway, but it was too much for them. And you'll see it later. You'll see it like 3, 4, 5 lessons later. Dog jumps on, everything looks good. You bring out the little whip and you see the dog kind of like they're still on the bite, but they're kind of like, oh, I don't know. And you can feel them let up, and sometimes they'll let go altogether.
And so they remember. They remember.
Right. And now that they've had a chance to cool off, like from their drive, which pushed them through it, emotionally speaking, they didn't enjoy it.
Yeah, it's like hesitating. It's like being that Olympic swimmer that choked because your coach yelled at you or whatever it was. Like it's crazy. It's really, when you start getting into intricacies of that type of work, it's definitely contextual. Definitely contextual. Wait, I want to circle back to that point. What was the point? So when you use force to shape behaviors and reinforce behaviors, even though there are a certain small percentage of dogs that can handle high levels of pressure, it has the potential occasion of developing what's known as learned helplessness, right? Do you want to break down a little bit to the audience what learned helplessness is?
Yeah, so learned helplessness is something that you want to avoid at all costs if you can, or no, not if you can, just avoid it, even if you can't. Figure it
Right.
out.
Right.
And this is something that is not specific to dogs or canines. This is the kind of thing that people in SeaWorld have to be worried about to not kind of develop in their like dolphins and other aquatic animals. So what learned helplessness is,
And humans,
and
actually.
humans, right,
Yeah.
absolutely right. How did I miss humans?
All the other animals in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, you know, all that
but,
stuff.
you know, humans.
And by the way, and people and stuff like that. So learned helplessness. What it is when an animal, but let's go back to dogs. So if a dog is unclear about why they are receiving a certain correction or reprimand, they don't know how to avoid it because they don't know how to put two and two together. So they become so nervous about it, they just stop making decisions, period. And that is what we call learned helplessness. In practice, I've seen it look something like too much leash pressure on a dog, let's say, like a younger keeler person, like you were talking about. You know, let's say we're using leash pressure sits, you know, with like a prong collar. So you're walking your dog with a short leash next to you on your left there. Pick upward on your leash to get the dog to prompt him to sit down. Sometimes people will pick up with a little too much vigor, and it ends up being like an upward correction. So the dog, instead of sitting down, will just flop to the ground altogether and then refuse to move because they're so nervous. They're like, I'm just not going to do anything.
Yep. They kind of shut down.
Right.
And I think that's the big thing we want to avoid. And, you know, as a younger dog trainer learning, you know, it's definitely not something you're proud of, but it's definitely something that you can understand. It's definitely not the right way to go. It's definitely not the right way to go. So, you know, I've been there where, you know, I've maybe put too much pressure on a dog before in one session, and I've had to work a whole week just to regain that dog's trust again.
Yeah.
You know, or to work extra hard with food just to compensate. Whereas maybe another trainer I was working with or who was working with that dog at the time didn't put that pressure, and, you know, their relationship is just fine. So there's so much to be said about learned helplessness. And, you know, it's so funny or not, it's not funny, but what's ironic is that a lot of dominance-based or punishment-based trainers will actually consider learned helplessness as a form of compliance, right? So they'll see that, well, the dog's not doing the thing that you hired me to train him to do. He's not lunging anymore. He's not barking anymore. But the dog is actually not doing anything because the dog's fucking scared of getting in trouble.
Right. You know? And what's crazy too is I've met a trainer in LA years and years ago. I was actually like applying to different like kennels to work for. And I was called back. And this, you know, I'm not going to name the kennel, but they had like a few locations they were doing okay. And part of their like application process, because the owner called me as like an on phone kind of interview, was he wanted to know how much I understood learned helplessness, but he considered it like almost the goal. I think I don't think I'm phrasing it quite right, but his thing was like he uses like choke chains and certain things, but he's absolutely against prong and e-collar and stuff like that. So I thought it was a little weird, but I was like, I mean, okay, it's your kennel, you know. If anything, I'll just have to learn a new type of training.
Was it the Zen dog?
No, it wasn't. And if it was, I wouldn't tell you. I don't want to call people. But no, it was not Zen Dog. They made it a point. It was on their website and everything. Like, you know, learned helplessness, and you know, and they were like, it's kind of a good thing. He brings it up to me, and he brought up even like the whole aquatic animals and this and that. And I was like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And he was like, oh good, then, you know, and he was all excited about it. And in my head, I'm just like, you know, maybe I'll just.
You're like, you're the owner of a company, and I'm applying for your company. Why do I know as much as you?
and the weird thing was his background was like an animal behaviorist, and I think that's where he kind of got it from. Was like, dude, like I've trained dolphins and I've trained this and I've trained this and I'm telling you, learn helplessness. Like that's what you want, because that's what helps you avoid the correction. That's why we can get away without using prong collars, e-collars. And I was like, are you sure that you get what's happening with dogs though? Like, I think we're thinking of two different things. I don't think learned helplessness is the goal. I think that you definitely can inhibit a certain behavior, but the difference between getting a dog into learned helplessness and getting them to understand what you don't want in no uncertain terms and getting them to avoid that particular thing is the dog doesn't feel like there's no way out. They know the way out.
Right.
they just know the wrong way and the right way. Whereas learned helplessness is like, I don't know. I'm just going to stay
Yeah.
put because I have no idea.
The dog has to have a sense of control in the situation.
Exactly.
Right. If the dog doesn't feel that they can make decisions or have any leverage to get out of the circumstance, it's no longer learning. It is abuse.
Right.
And if we can't lay out that paradigm for them where they go, okay, if you do X, this happens. If you do Y, this happens. Then it's not fair for the dog, right? The dog can't learn properly. So totally, I get that. And that's kind of like where like emotional corrections come in wrong. You know, they don't play right because, you know, someone out of anger or sadness or fear will correct their dogs. And maybe the timing was off. Maybe there was too much force. Maybe it was a disproportionate correction to the offense, right? And the dog just goes, all right, shit. Well, fucking my mom or my dad was just super mad at me that time. And I guess I'll try and avoid getting them mad, but they have no clue what made you mad in the first place, right?
Right. So now they're walking on eggshells.
Yeah, they walk on eggshells, and some people look at them walking on eggshells as compliance, which
is
as
good. Yeah, which is insane.
Good. Yeah, my dog's scared of me. That's a good thing. No, it's not a good thing.
Right.
It's not a good thing. And I tell you what, as a young dog trainer, I didn't understand that until we wanted to actually teach dogs to do things out of the realm of just compliance. You know, and this is where some of the dominance dog trainers really get caught up. They think that the dog constantly being in appeasement mode is healthy and compliant. It's not. Like, simply put, it's not.
Right.
But anyways, well, that'll be a whole separate episode.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I just wanted to add before we continue that I don't think it's bad. Like, I think it's important actually that we are upfront, you know. So I appreciate that because I've been there too. I'm not going to hide it for a second. I've definitely put too much pressure on a dog, you know, guilty, sure. And just like you, I'm not proud of it at all. It was wrong, you know, and as a dog trainer, I should have known better. And I'm glad to say that I do now and so on. But I think it's important that we point these things out because people who listen to this trust that we're being honest. And so it's good, you know, it's good to be able to assess yourself. Like, was this too much? Does the dog very clearly understand what's happening? What are the parameters of the situation right now? And if you're not sure about any of this stuff, take a step back, do some more food prep stuff, and then push them through when they're ready. And I think, you know, I'm not going to harp back on the whole example that I talked about of the bite sleep dog and having too much pressure in the moment.
Right.
But I will say that as a younger trainer, I was quick to put pressure on dogs too. I was very much of the killer, you know, kind of mindset as well. As I've evolved in my training, I understand that there is merit to pressuring a dog, sure. But that kind of stuff works out much better, much safer later in training. Do the groundwork first. Then the dog has kind of emotional like strength that they can hold the weight of this pressure that you're putting on them. But early in training, it can be very harmful.
I agree. 100%. 100%
But yeah, sorry to harp on that, man. I didn't mean to keep bringing it up. So how about we dive into some good practices?
Yeah, let's go into good practices. And okay, good practices. So good practices would start off with strong foundation, kind of a great segue. So if we have a good foundation on our dogs, then pretty much we will only have to use correction as needed, or we can use them in moderation, right? The corrections in and of themselves should be rare, but they should be effective corrections, right? So if I've done a lot of food work, if I've done a lot of training, if I've done a lot of prep work, if I've done a lot of shaping with motivational tools, pretty much I should have done my best, or at least maxed out in the amount of time that I was training and scaffolding lesson plans to get as much focus from the dog as I possibly could have, right? Now, once I've done that, then we might see, let's say you've been able to reach 85 to 90% of the dog's focus. But there's that 10% of the dog's focus that's very difficult to get because the dog is a scent hound and he likes to put his nose to the ground, or the dog has a high prey drive. And every time you go to the park, anytime he hears a squeak, he takes a look to see where it's coming from, right? So in those scenarios, we should have very rare but effective corrections to be able to get our dogs back on task of whatever it is that we're trying to teach them, right? And so with very high, again, we see this in very high drive dogs, the use of corrections at the higher forms of training are actually really effective in sharpening certain skills People in competition work, people in, protection sports use correction a lot, but definitely even in competitive obedience work, they use correction to start shaping certain things, which is interesting. But yeah, it takes a lot of prep work. It takes, corrections need to be very rare and effective. That's a good sign of it. We only need them as needed. How about you, man? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that I agree with all that, but I think that some stuff that I would like to add to, if we're talking good practices, proper tools, and proper tools vary. I believe in prong collars. I believe in e-collars. They're not always a one-size-fits-all approach. I've been a prong collar trainer for much longer than an e-collar trainer. Prong collars have tons of benefits, even some that like supersede e-collar stuff. But I meet lots of dogs that just do better on this versus that. Some do better on the prong, some do better on the e-collar, and it's our job to assess that as best we can, because sometimes just a small adjustment in the tool can make a world of difference. And sometimes that means backing down from intensity too. Like we talked about plastic star mark collars as opposed to like metal prong collars. Now, I've had foster dogs in the past that were very sensitive dogs, like feral dogs that weren't even used to having leashes on. And, but we're talking that dog with, months of training. So now it's like a full on trained dog, but still a sensitive, kind of jumpy, like very like shepherdy dog. Now, prong collar worked, but you could see even with light pressure, it was like, mentally speaking, it was hitting the dog very hard. And we're talking like light pressure. So I backed him down to a star mark collar, plastic. They're not as like potent in their correction, which can be good, right? Depending on the situation. Moved him onto that, and he works out amazingly well with that. So we keep him on that thing. And I think that proper tools can make a world of difference. Proper timing and intensity. I mean, that's really all of dog training in any facet ever. But if your timing or like your intensity of your corrections are off, you are going to push your dog most likely into learned helplessness. Now you're probably doing more harm than good. So really try to dial that in as best you can.
Right. Well, on both sides of the spectrum too, because intensity could also be underwhelming as well.
Exactly. Right. That's why I didn't say like too much. It's just, it's improper. It can be this or that. You can be too early or too late. You can be too much, too little. It's definitely important to make sure that you're as on the money as you can be, and understanding again, I'm glad that you liked the idea of moving target, because it applies all the time. It's like, depending on the situation, depending on the tool and the owner and whatever's happening, correction, like, where in that space of time depends, and how intense your correction, it all depends. And it's our job to best find these moments in time and mark them as clearly as possible for the dog, and then take what we've learned and then convey that over to the owner so that they can pick it up and keep going with it for the rest of the dog's life.
Right. And I want to just bounce off of that and just say, like, proper timing and proper intensity and the use of proper tools and just becoming savvy. As dog trainers, we know these things take time to learn, right? And that's why it's so invaluable for you guys to have proper trainers actually helping you guys learn these skills, learn these tools.
Yes.
Because once you learn these skills and you learn these tools, you'll see vast differences, right? I think, and when you buy these tools out, at the pet store, they don't come with instructions. They don't come with a YouTube channel that you can look up and figure out actually the proper ways to use it or the proper practices. So, it's very easy to give overwhelming corrections, to have bad timing, to pick the wrong tool. But ultimately, what the end goal of it, of all of this is that if we do things properly, we use corrections to a minimum. We should always be rewarding dogs way more than we're correcting, right? It should at least be a 5-to-1, right? Like 5 times more positive reinforcement than there is correction. And that's just simply based on just happiness, right? That's simply based on, if we're correcting 50-50, well, that means the dog's not completely clear on what the right decision should be. Right. So that means we got to do more prep work. But ultimately, our goal is to give the minimal amount of corrections as needed. But when we do give those corrections, give the appropriate type, whether it's a lure, whether it's a reminder, whether it's a correction, right? However you look at it, or whatever varying degrees in between, make sure that it fits the offense that your dog is doing.
Right.
And the end goal of any training practice, whether it be corrections, food, markers, whatever it is it's eventually to phase out, to be able to use the technique with such potency that eventually you have the ability to phase out of that technique in and of itself, right? If you can phase out the use of corrections, you know you're doing well. If you can phase out the use of food, if you can phase out the use of markers, if you can phase out, any type of tool that you're using initially in training, that means you're doing a hell of a job in progressing your dogs to the next levels of training. If you can't, that means you need a little bit more work and help getting you there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's, I think that's where we largely agree. But my slight disagreement with you is like, if a tool works, corrections wise, yes, I correct my dogs as absolutely little as I can. I mean, why not, right? I don't want to correct my dogs any more than I have to. And with proper training, of course, that like, propensity, that amount of time that I spend correcting will go down. And that's on me as an owner, 100%. But as far as like phasing out the tool, I stick with it. I think if my dog finds a tool that works, if it's a prong collar or e-collar or whatever, or a combo of the two or whatever the case, and they just work for me, if I'm not really correcting hardly ever anyway, but I know that if and when I have to, they work out, I'm more of the mindset of like, I want owners to do whatever makes them not only like emotionally kind of feel the most in control, but also have the most control, like should they ever need it. It's kind of like a seatbelt. I don't want the dog to be lunging, but if they do, just I'd rather you be ready.
Right.
And just forget what your owner or your owner, sorry, what your neighbor thinks about the e-collar or whatever the case, because it's your job to keep your dog safe and healthy and happy and so on.
Right.
But yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to bring up with you, Brent, is since we've geared this podcast from the beginning toward younger dog trainers, I want to ask you something that I think they could take huge benefit from. So let's say we're talking now to someone like who's listening to the podcast who believes in corrections. Maybe they're a younger dog trainer. Maybe they believe in certain tools. Maybe not. It's all good. But let's say they believe in like e-collars and prong collars and stuff. But they tend to have a hard time sometimes getting an owner on board with understanding why and how these things are effective and helpful. So I like to kind of play that little role play game and just kind of explain a little bit of how I would go about it when someone's like weary of it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it can make or break how the training trajectory looks. So how would you go about getting someone on board who's a little nervous about corrections?
That's a freaking fabulous question, because we run into it all the time. And I think the well, I wouldn't say the best, but definitely there's many angles there's many angles we can approach this from. For me, it really depends on the type of owner I'm dealing with, right? If I have an owner who is very sensitive, right, to just physical correction in general, sometimes what I like to do is I like to explain to them, the fact that physical correction is a way that we actually get dogs to be present, right? So that's one angle that we can do. So a lot of times dogs are over here obsessing over a squirrel or a bird or something like that. And for so long, the dogs are in their heads. They're thinking about what they could do with that bird when he's in his mouth. But sometimes when we give a physical correction, it brings dogs back to their body, right? And in essence, it almost makes dogs mindful sometimes of like, oh, hey, I'm here and I'm on a leash. And I'm with my owner. Totally forgot. That's crazy. Right. And so that's one angle. It really depends. My approach changes based on the owners that I have. Because I really want it to connect with something, a core value that they have, because corrections do have a place in dog training. And my job as an educator is to try to make this make sense for them. There's not an easy answer to that question, but maybe give me your perspective and let's see if I can narrow it down, because there's a lot of stuff going through my head right now.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. And I think that like, I'm happy to do that, but I think already that was more beneficial than you think it is, because mind you, me and you talk about this all the time, but some people could hear that and be like, whoa, boom, so let me dive in. But real quick, sorry about the barking, guys. We are dog trainers, occupational hazard. I'm afraid, please roll with it. It's not a big deal. I think we'll be okay. So I brought this up because I think anyway that you and I in particular have always kind of had a, we have different ways of going about it, but we've both been good at that, getting owners
Mhm.
on board. And my way of going about it, let's say I'll stick with the same example. Let's say it's a sensitive person that's like, they just don't want to correct the dog,
Mhm.
but they already kind of somewhat understand that the dog may need corrections, at least enough to hear me out, which
Right.
is typically all I need. And how I'll go about it would be getting them to understand that correcting your dog and stopping them from doing these things and having these misunderstandings of the world and what their job is in this present moment. Let's say they lunge at people on the walk or in the house or whatever the case. It's for their benefit, which sounds crazy, but the thing is, dogs look to us for direction, and a couple things are very clear from the jump. If your dog is lunging and having these issues, number one, your dog has no idea what he's supposed to be doing because he thinks he
Right.
can protect the house. Number two, your dog is already under a significant amount of emotional stress and pressure because happy-go-lucky dogs don't lunge and bite.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, number three, I see where the disconnect is kind of based on one and two. I understand that you're afraid of correcting your dog, and I don't knock you for it. You're a very sweet person. I get that.
Mhm.
It's my job as a trainer, though, to and let me throw that in, by the way. Like whenever I explain this to people, I give them even that to try to help them like understand I'm on your side. It's
Right.
I don't knock you. This is why people like me have jobs, but I want to do my job and let you know that as the dog's owner, they're saying a lot of they're speaking in volumes to you. You're just not picking up on it, which is okay. You're doing the right thing either way because you're finding out. So you're not doing wrong by your dog. You just needed a little help is all. And then
Mhm.
I'll kind of dive into the whole listen, these things that your dog is doing are telling me in no uncertain terms that your dog lacks structure, lacks understanding, definitely lacks focus and a sense of calmness and inner peace like you were talking about, bringing
Mhm.
the dog back to the present. I'm a big like horror movie nut, so I love the whole like Friday the 13th. Like your dog kind of makes up stories in their head that aren't really there. You know,
Mhm.
Freddy,
Mhm.
Freddy can only hurt
Mhm.
you. Freddy Krueger can only hurt the people in the movies if they are afraid of him. If you're not,
Good point.
that's how it works. Even if he's in your
Right.
dream, if you're not scared, he can't hurt you. So
Right.
dogs kind of make these things real, at which point it starts hurting them, like in an emotional sense. So they lash out, which makes sense in that particular context. But we have to have a deeper understanding and kind of seeing it from that 10,000-foot view of like, look, as your owner, I'm telling you, don't worry about that person at the door. Go lay down and chill out, man. Just hang out. And over time, you can make very real progress with your dog. And that's typically how I'll go about speaking to someone, getting them on board. And it works a huge percentage of the time.
Right. Right. Well, I'm so glad you shared that perspective with me because then it definitely opened up my mind to a bunch of different other angles that we could approach this from. I think kind of going back to the blocking behaviors example that we gave earlier on in the podcast, the idea of blocking a behavior is like we're helping our dogs make the right decisions. And I think one of the uses of corrections is to help mitigate this idea of like, okay, you have all these options. Let me help you make the right decision. When the dog makes the right decision, now we can reward for those right decisions. So good correction actually means less corrections in the future, and
Mm-hmm.
less corrections in the future actually means we can do more positive reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the idea here is it should be a means to an end, right? When we are correcting, especially in the shaping process or the reinforcement process, the better and more consistent we are with the use of corrections, the less we have to do it, which means we've been able to shape a behavior properly. We've been able to, guide the dog to consistent behavior patterns again. And that's ultimately the goal, right? Everyone understands the idea of consequence, both good and bad consequences. The problem is not everyone is comfortable with the practices with our, four-legged animals, right? Like with our, we don't want to cross the line of abuse. We don't want to cross the line of cruelty. We don't want to cross the line of quote unquote being mean, right? You don't have to be mean in order for it to be effective. And that's something that Ian Dunbar says all the time. You don't have to be cruel. You don't have to be harsh to be effective. However, I think one of the big things that has to be done is you have to be insistent and you need to know what you want. And sometimes our dogs don't know what we want, and it's our job to teach them.
Right. Right. I was going to say that your dog needs to know what you want as well.
Exactly.
100%. Yeah, but I love that. I think that you adding that definitely adds clarity to your position, and hearing all the rest of it. I get you, and I agree.
Awesome, man. I
Yeah.
love it. Well, let's see. What else do we got to talk about, or are we done?
I think we're good, man. I think
We're
just
good.
the final points that we were going to put on this were just context. Complete context is paramount when you're working with a dog. If you're working with corrections, make sure that you understand context. If you're a younger dog trainer who needs guidance from someone with a little more experience, reach out. If you're a client or an owner rather, who's looking for a trainer
Mm-hmm.
or considering doing training, look into a trainer who is competent and completely understands, to a healthy depth, all the ins and outs of corrective training. Because again, like we've talked about, before, even within one particular realm of training, someone's competency within that particular like methodology
Mm-hmm.
can make a huge difference.
100%. 100%. Other things we want to take a look at, guys, take a look at that 10,000 foot view of what's going on, right? It's so easy, especially when we're looking at bad behaviors, that we focus on specific problems and we look at them as nails that we want to hammer down and like hit the nail right on the head. Well, a lot of times when we're dealing with things that need to be quote unquote corrected, there might be some underlying issues. There might be some preparation work that needs to be done in order to be able to address that underlying issue. And so ultimately, I want you guys to always look at the big picture. What am I correcting for? What is the grand scheme of things? What is the behavior the actual desired behavior that I want? Because just remember, correction is not the answer. Correction is a tool that helps you in discovering the answer. Right. So it's not a fix all by any means. And then also take a look at, different developmental needs. Also, I think dogs, as they get older, they change. When we go from a puppy, we'll go through 4 developmental shifts in 1 year of their life. Right. So, how much correction I use on a 3-week-old or on a 3-month-old puppy versus a 3-year-old puppy or dog, it's very different. Right. And obviously the personality of the dog, the temperament, the circumstance, the behavior that the dog's going through, all of those things vary. But ultimately, just kind of have an open mind about it. Again, for those of you guys who are on either side of the fence when it comes to, whether you're anti-correction or pro-correction, understand that there is always a balance that needs to be achieved in the execution and practice of correction work. That's all. That's what I want to say. Right? Anything else you want to say, Mariano?
No, you did that perfectly, man.
Awesome, man. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us here on episode 14. This is a deeper look into corrections in training. Feel free to please add me and Mariano on Instagram. Mariano is at UNTAMEDDOGCO, which is Untamed Dog CO. And go ahead and add me at CANISBEHAVIOR. Make sure you guys check back at our next couple episodes because we're going to be going all over a lot of cool subject matter. Please also leave a comment, reviews, like us, subscribe to this channel, whether you guys are listening to us on YouTube or whether you guys are listening to us on any one of the major platforms, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We're on all of them. So thank you guys so much for just listening. Thank you so much for sharing everything. If you guys have any questions or you guys want us to talk about certain subject matters, please go ahead and email us at dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. And we'd be happy to hear from you guys. We would really love to hear your guys' feedback and comments. But yeah, other than that, thank you guys so much for listening. My name is Brent. That guy over there is Mariano Alvarez. Sexy fucking guy. Anyways, you guys have a great night and we will see you guys next week. Peace.